Merry Christmas! Almost, that is. Hi, this is Penny Hallgren from quiltblocklibrary.com, quiltblocklibrary.tv, and howtoquilt.com. That's how-to-quilt.com. Today, for Christmas, I thought I would show you how to sew this Christmas star block together, but when you blow it up and make it big enough, you can actually make one small wall hanging about 32 inches square out of just this one block. And I'll admit, when I first looked at this, I thought, oh my gosh, there are going to be all these little half square triangles and squares and all this complication. However, I ran across a system. It's Jody Barrow's Square in a Square system, and she has all kinds of different methods so that you can just sew squares and strips together and then cut them apart using her special template, which is a Square in a Square template, and you can make all of these designs just using squares, strips, and cutting them apart with the template. This particular quilt is from her book called Advancing on 2 Square in a Square Template, Square in a Square Technique. And it's actually on page 53. So I'm just going to follow along her step by step. I've got all my fabric cut, so let's go to the sewing table so that I can start sewing these together for you. You can see I've got squares and strips of various widths cut here, and so I'm just going to start working my way through the instructions. The first thing I'm going to do is start with a 4-inch square, and then I'm going to take 2 1/4 inch wide of the white strips and sew them onto the outside of the squares. And to do that, I'm just going to take my 2 1/4 inch strips and sew my squares on top. And then I'm just going to, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'll sew this first square, leave a little bit of space, and then sew the second square. Now I've got the white strip sewn on one side, so I'll take another white strip and sew it on the other side, across from these two. And I'm going to leave these hooked together, because then once both of the strips are sewn on, I can cut them apart. Now I've got these two sides sewn on. I'm going to cut this strip off, or I'll cut these strips in between. Now for the second go around, I could sew these onto whole strips. However, that would take a lot of extra fabric, because what I'm going to be doing is trimming this off. So what I'm going to do is just take these little strips, which have been cut to be about 1/2 inch longer than the center square, and then I'll just sew these on and continue stitching all the way through the outside. So I'm going to end up using my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then when I fold this open, I'm going to have something that looks like that. Now I have my 2 red squares with the white on the outside, and I'm going to take them over to my ironing board and press it so that both of them, so that the seam allowances are facing on the outside. And then I'm going to take them over to my cutting table and use the magic Square in Square ruler to cut these so that they are a square in a square. Now, using Jody's option number 14 in order to trim this, what I've done is lined the corner here of my red square up with the edge of the ruler and matched a line here so that I know that I'm cutting this off straight. And then I'm also checking this grid line. So the instructions are to trim the white off at the point of where the square meets in the corner. So I'm just going to do that, and then I'll turn it around and continue to do that all the way around the outside. Now for my second row, I'm going to take my green, and these are the green 2 5/8 inch strips, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to sew these on to here using my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'll just sew them all the way around the outside. And you'll notice as you sew these greens on, you will be cutting off the tip of the corner here in your square. And that's all right, because what's going to happen is after we get this all sewn together, we're going to be cutting this square into 4 pieces. Now that I've got my green sewn on, I want to cut this off trim the excess off. And this time, I'm going to leave the 1/4 inch seam allowance past the corner of the square. So I'm going to line up my square going through the center here, and then I'll just trim off each one of the sides so that I've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance past the end of that. Now that I have my 2 squares this way, I'm going to take a strip of my white and add it onto all 4 sides of the outside. Now I have all the layers sewn on here, and what I'm doing is trimming this one so that it gets cut off right at the point. So I'll trim all the way around the outside. The next thing I need to do is take this and cut it into quarters through the center. So I'm going to take my ruler and line it up. I've got a grid line here that goes across the top, so that's going to line up the outside here, and then down with the bottom point here. And I'm just going to cut right through the center, and then I'll turn this around and do the same thing on the other side. And then when I spread it apart, I've got 4 units that look like that. Now I'm ready to do the same thing. I'll go through the same steps, only this time starting with the green squares. So I'll start with those and then sew my 2.5 inch white strips on the outside. Well, I'm replacing the red with green, so I'll be sewing green and then white and then red strips on the outside, and then white again. I need 4 of those, the same as I made with the red center square. So now all I have to do is sew this together, and then I've got my little wall hanging complete. And so the first thing I'm going to do is fold these over. So I'll be sewing these 2 columns right sides together. But I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and sew this so that it's one piece. So what I'll do is fold these down and then sew the pairs together until I have one solid piece. So this is going to be one rectangle. Now I've got this whole section sewn together, and the next step is to sew these 4 patches together and these 4 patches together. Once I've got those sewn together, then I'll add these to the top of this center patch and these to the bottom. Now I've got these little 4 patches on the top and the bottom, so I'll just fold these over and sew these together. And then the last piece of this is to take these 2 columns and sew them together. This Christmas star wall hanging is finished in pretty much record time. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I didn't have to cut all the triangles out and worry about matching up the tips and ends of the triangles. It's pretty cool. It's a decent sized wall hanging, and it's all ready to be layered, quilted, and have a border put, or have maybe borders, bindings, whatever. Anyway, it's ready to finish. Thanks for joining me. This is Penny Hallgren from quiltblocklibrary.com and quiltblocklibrary.tv, and also howtoquilt.com. That's how-to-quilt.com. And you can find more about the Square in a Square template when you go to howtoquilt.com. Thanks again. Happy quilting.